Hello and welcome to the last webinar of this year's Sustainable Cities course. Over this course, we covered topics exploring critical questions such as what makes a city function, how to reduce urban inequality, how to make cities safe and inclusive, improving human development in cities, how cities can be made resilient, etc. Today, while we are in the catch-up week of the course, let's interact with Aromar Revi for a closing round of debates and discussions. As you know, Aro is a director of IHS and has been a senior advisor to various ministries of the Government of India, consulted with a wide range of multilateral, bilateral, development, and private sector institutions, and works on economic and environmental and social change at various scales. We will start this webinar by listening to Aro for about 15 minutes. In the meanwhile, please write in your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box. Over to you, Aro.
Thanks so much. It's nice to be back with you. I believe the course is doing quite well. I got a couple of emails today from people as it's coming to an end. Of course, I think for some of you this might be a little hectic, but we've found a connection from the digital world into the real world. There was a team that wrote to me from Germany today saying that they'd like to come and see what's happening as far as climate change is concerned in India. So these are the things that we hope will happen. That many of you who've been on the course have sort of got to know each other, are actually working in different locations around solving problems and addressing questions of urban sustainability. And you will stay in touch with us. A lot of the faculty who've been on this, a number of the institutions that you've engaged with, and hopefully together we can try and address these questions very concretely. Over the last almost 4 years or so since the SDGs came into place, a lot of things have been happening in different parts of the world. Of course, it's a lot slower than we would like it to be, because in some senses we don't have very much time. Like I've said earlier, we have about 4,000 odd days to be able to implement this agenda, and they're extremely complex challenges to deal with, because as you've seen, cities are places where, of course, you can bring all of these responses together. But there are a whole range of different questions that sort of interconnect, whether it's questions of employment, questions of environmental justice or environmental access, or just questions of good old governance and service delivery. So in many parts of the world, what you're seeing just now is the beginning of a coming together of local governments, so mayors and their own systems in some parts of the world. In other parts of the world, it's driven a lot more by bureaucrats and people who actually manage cities. A coming together between local governments, between citizens and citizens movements, enterprises, and knowledge institutions. So this is a new thing that we're seeing. I am a member of the advisory board of UCLG, which is the the apex organization of local governments across the world. At least 20,000 of them that are active, and of course many more potentially in that network. And one of the core things that's happening just now is that mayors are coming forward and saying, look, we need to and we would like to try and integrate SDG processes into what we're doing in terms of problem solving. That, of course, means that there are opportunities to do real things, sometimes with public funds, sometimes with initiatives that people from the enterprise sector, from small and large firms, sometimes transnational firms, are trying to sort of engage with and trying to address this. So there's a shift that's taking place, but the challenge for us is that we have to bring together a large pool of change makers like yourselves to start actually working on the ground to deal with things piece by piece. Because eventually, we have to work on this from the ground level upwards, whether it's trying to improve school systems, whether it's trying to deal with equity and employment, or whether it's to deal with questions of housing. So there've been a whole range of high-level questions that a number of you have been coming through on the last few weeks, or let's say a month or so. One question, of course, is about what are the assumptions that we are making in terms of the SDGs. So the SDGs themselves are a framework, but they're an interesting framework because they're politically negotiated. Otherwise, people have good ideas, or maybe one government has a good idea and the opposition doesn't like it. But this is a framework that was co-created between 2013 and 15, and some of us were part of that process. In fact, many of us were part of that process, of trying to see how different countries that have completely different perspectives, some that are relatively, at an early stage of development with relatively low per capita incomes, low levels of urbanization, and others that are almost completely urban and, both high income, but also those that are driven by service sector economies. So all of them came together to negotiate this process. So of course, there are many assumptions that are embedded. But at the current point of time, and I would imagine for the next 10 or 12 years, this is the negotiated settlement that the countries of the world, which are represented in the United Nations, are using to test whether they can, move forward and respond to the aspirations of their citizens and the challenges, of course, that we're dealing with simultaneously in many parts of the world. So the difference, of course, from earlier things is A, it's built on the entities, you know about that, and you're building on some experience. B, it is a process that is universal, and one of the biggest challenges we're facing just now is it's good to agree on something at the United Nations where you're looking at it globally, but when it comes down to delivery on the ground in a particular location, there is a significant challenge in what we call localizing the implementation of the SDGs. So when you try and localize, you find that the context that you're dealing with may not, reflect the aspirations or the indicators of the processes that have been agreed at the global scale. And I think this tension is very real. This is one reason why I think so many of us have to get out and try and interpret and implement these kind of processes on the ground, so that inevitably what we're doing in our own countries and our own cities are actually going to be a transliteration, a interpretation in the context that we're talking about. So that's one thing that's said. So the assumption was that if things were universal and it was good for everybody to work, but in some contexts, many of the things we're talking about in terms of homelessness, for example, in high-income contexts, the kind of homelessness that you see in countries like India are very different. So you have to sort of reinterpret that in that particular context. The SDG framework was, of course, meant to be quite simple. It has, because of the fact that it was negotiated and there were so many interests, it's actually become quite complicated. If you're dealing with 169 targets and even more indicators, it means that there are a whole range of things that everybody can't deal with. So one of the really interesting challenges, and this is where innovation is happening in different places, is different cities or different countries are interpreting things in terms of their own priorities. So take an example. Some of you would have seen what the city of New York has done. I mean, they were doing their own thing, and then they discovered the SDGs were important, and they produced this framework, which is One NYC, which tries to bring the elements of the SDGs which I think are critical together. And then over the last 2 years or so, they've actually been tracking this. So you can look at the original framework, you can see how they're performing year on year. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand. The SDGs are about a set of normative goals, and how we are able to then try and see how we can get to them as quickly as possible, preferably before 2030 or certainly very quickly afterwards. So you have to take a process, set up a normative goal, let's say, of providing a certain level of employment, providing universal access to basic services, and work backwards to see how this can be implemented. Now, the interesting thing about the goal framework is that it interconnects a whole range of things. So, for example, you can't actually do adequate housing or affordable housing without having addressed questions of land. That also means basic services, which means that you have to have water and you have to have energy, and of course you have to have accessible mobility. Now, if you look at the goal framework and its connection, between, let's say, SDG 11 and others that deal with employment, like 8, when you start implementing these things in consonance or in synergy with each other, you get considerable gains. Because instead of looking at things in silos, the way that very often our governments, our cities have been managed, you can now think of joining them up. Now, this is difficult because people are not used to thinking this way. This is not the way that laws and governance systems are organized. But this is the way that I think we can help accelerate processes quite quickly. So one of the things that we debate with other colleagues in different parts of the world is about the fact that between now, we're at 2019, and let's say 2022, we have to actually build the institutional processes, the infrastructure, and the base from which we can start rapidly accelerating over the next 8 years after that to reach the SDGs reach at least most of them by 2030. So it's important for us just now to experiment, to try and build our capacity, to find a whole range of people like ourselves who can work together in whichever sector we're talking about, and then try and institutionalize those processes, because eventually the key thing is, if you don't put the last first, if you don't address the core promise of the SDGs, that is, leave no one behind, it will be impossible to try and achieve where we want to get to over the next, like I said, 4,000 odd days. So if you have to reach 5,000 places in 4,000 days, it effectively means you have to bring on a new place and get to scale literally one a day. So it's an interesting challenge for us to actually engage with, and I'm hoping that many of you will actually step into those roles as professionals, as young professionals, as people who will be actually leading this process over the next decade or so. There were other questions, of course, about the economic and social development paradigm. The world is a complex place. There are very, very different kinds of economic entities in the world. Some of them have completely controlled and regulated markets. Others are completely open, and the assumptions that they sit in are actually quite different. Some of them have functioning land markets and labor markets. Others have much more, let's say, socialist forms of organization as far as they're concerned. So in some senses, one size cannot fit all as far as the world is concerned, even within a country. In large federal countries like, let's say, Russia or Brazil or South Africa or India, etc., what's happening in one part of the country or in one type of city is very different from what's happening otherwise. So one has to look at heterodox responses to economic questions. And of course, by and large, because the world is interconnected, because there is significant trade, even a country like China, which has the Communist Party as a dominant sort of political force there, even they have a very significant amount of trade that moves back and forth. In fact, they produce a lot of the goods and some of the services that we see in many other parts of the world. So inevitably, let's say, capitalist systems do sort of dominate a whole range of processes. So I guess one of the assumptions is that at least mixed economies or economies that have a strong emphasis on capitalist modes of production are actually something that sit behind forms of urbanization. But that doesn't always have to be so. About a month ago, I spent a week in Havana in Cuba, and Cuba is one of those places which is still very different from other parts of the world, partially because they're cut off or they have been forcibly cut off from other parts of the world in terms of trade, in terms of economic development, and a whole range of things. So they have a system of urban management, of dealing with questions of food security, of access to services, free education and healthcare, which is very different from other parts of the world. So I think we have to learn when we're thinking of complex problem solving in a context, to draw experiences from different places. So, for example, in Cuba, there are two systems: people from the outside, people who come in as tourists or as foreigners coming from the outside. They work in an economy which is pegged to the international market. It has a separate currency in some senses, while people inside Cuba have a different currency that works. Now, to many people in the world, it may seem like this is a very primitive system. It doesn't work. It's harking back to an era which is over and done with. But in actual fact, if you look at the ground situation in the people that we have the opportunity of meeting, because if you look at the consumption basket, food is accessible at relatively low prices. Education and healthcare are free, all the way from the time you're born till pretty much the time you die. And housing is something that's provided effectively as a right to everybody. The quality of housing is not very good because people are unable sometimes to maintain public spaces. The investment that the Cuban state, which kind of owns all the land, has made in that kind of in that thing has been limited. So you go around in Havana, you see places that are crumbling, which might have been very very beautiful and sort of very effectively managed housing stock. So the reason I gave that example is that the assumptions that we make about economic systems have to be deeply examined, because there are some things that don't work for us. I mean, one of the challenges that we're seeing in many parts of the world after the 2008 economic crisis, whether it's North Africa or Southern Europe or even parts of the United States and increasingly now in Latin America, is the fact that we are unable to create an adequate number of jobs because of the nature of the economy and its relationship with urban areas. So we're actually, because of some people actually having greater access to resources, technology being actually quite critical, some people get a much greater advantage. In fact, what we've seen over the last decade or more is in many parts of the world that inequality is actually growing. So you have a very small proportion of the population that controls not only the economic output, but also the wealth. And because you have the wealth and much of the wealth is concentrated in cities, it actually exacerbates the challenges we deal with. And I guess there is a reaction to that happening in both politics and a whole range of other processes. So in some senses, this is a critical question that we have to address, obviously in different contexts. So looking at the economic assumptions of where you live in, how the play of power and resources and who controls what is, I think, quite an important part of what we're doing. And of course, the reason why countries embrace the SDGs, or the reason why we started working on the Millennium Development Goals, whatever it is, almost 20 years ago, was because the core promise of making sure that nobody lives in poverty, that there would be no hunger everywhere, and everybody would have all the basic core services, including adequate housing, is in a sense something that we have to deliver at the heart of what we're talking about. So you can have lots of interesting other things, but if you don't actually deliver on these questions, especially for the most vulnerable, I think we've neither done the SDGs service, nor are we addressing what our fellow citizens would actually need to do and engage with. So hopefully, over the long many weeks that we've been working on this together, you would have got some sense of this from different parts of the world, and we're very glad that you've kind of spent time with us, and we hope we can take this forward in something concrete. So I'll be happy to open this up for discussion. Any questions that you have, if I have sort of some answers and responses, I'm happy to split it.
Thank you for the introduction, Aro. Let's start with questions from the discussion forum. What are the assumptions, if any, the course is making about the city? Of course, the UN SDG framework could be what the course is also basing itself on. If that is the case, then the question would be, what are the assumptions that the SDG framework is making, and whether all those are valid, or does the course also have a critical view on the SDG framework?
Yeah, I kind of, in the introduction, I kind of partly addressed that question. So I said, yes, the SDG framework is a politically, negotiated framework. It makes a whole range of assumptions. The most important one is about the universality of the SDGs. To address that, we have to deal with questions of localization. Not everything fits everywhere. So I think one has to look at priorities very much from the bottom up, and countries and cities, I gave you the example of New York, are actually addressing these questions in their own context. And it's not only New York that's doing this, but many other cities across the world where climate action, for example, is becoming active, where a whole range of poverty-related processes are taking on, like in Bangkok or in the Philippines and various other places. You see those processes playing themselves out.
Thanks, Aro. The next question is also from the discussion forum. In the course, are we taking the current global economic paradigm and financial processes as a given within which the cities have to strive to become sustainable? Or do we also look at the economic paradigms also critically as ideas that may need to change for cities to become sustainable, or perhaps are even a part of the problem that makes cities unsustainable and inequitable? In our imagination of what or how cities need to be, are there some assumptions about global economics and how it would be or need to be that we are making? If there are, could these be made more explicit?
Like the example that I was giving you from Havana, not everything is the same, but we are in a globally interconnected world. Some parts are less connected than others, and in this globally interconnected world, capital has an important role to play. But that creates significant challenges, inequality being one of them. And of course, the thing is that many of these challenges become intergenerational challenges. If you don't have access to an adequate education, and the economic structure of the city or country is changing. You're moving from a manufacturing-based city to a service sector-led city, where, let's say, IT and services, etc., are important, which means that education is important. It means that inequalities can actually be exacerbated from one generation to the other. So there are assumptions that, in a sense, the United Nations and many of us are making in this process, that the stability of the global economic system would not be significantly changed. But we do know that there's severe challenges with it. We do know that that inequality in many parts of the world is clearly unsustainable. And cities are part of that. So like I've said earlier in the session, cities create lots of opportunity, but in some cases, because of structural questions, they actually exacerbate a whole range of issues. They can exacerbate poverty, they can exacerbate inequality, and they can exacerbate risk. So one of the core questions for us is how we actually balance those processes out. And they have to be answered in the context of the national economy. I mean, if you're, let's say, a state that's there in the Gulf region of the world, where there's a lot of export that takes place of energy, and a whole range of other things actually have to be important. There's a lot of flux in cities like Dubai or Qatar, etc. So the situation there in terms of sustainability is going to be very different from another region where there's much less resource flows that go from the international market into that city. So the solutions that you find are context specific, but there are some things that are non-negotiable. Let's say if your carbon footprint becomes so significant that you're working at 4 or 5, or maybe in some places in the world 10 tons per capita, and you're not bringing it down to 1 ton per capita, you're in trouble, and so is the world, because that's clearly unsustainable. Or if you don't actually have water resources to sustain the functioning of the city will actually not go. So there's a strong relationship between the city and the region, and that is driven by regional economics. So I think looking critically at some of these questions, looking critically at the questions of equity and inequality, access to employment and growth, that at one end could help create new jobs, especially for young people, and growth that in some senses, because it's very driven by the capital investment that's made, will actually destroy employment, is something that we have to look at very critically and understand and respond to. So yeah, I mean, we are making some assumptions, there's no doubt about that, but I think I'm encouraging you to look at them critically in your own context and in the understanding that the world is still pretty interconnected in spite of the trade wars that are threatening to break out now and then. But the local and regional economy, the territorial economy, is often very, very important to examine. So I hope that sort of adequate response to the kind of questions that we're having on the discussion forum.
Thanks, Aro. Here's another question from the discussion forum. Could you elaborate on SDG monitoring and evaluating mechanisms? How are cities and city governments doing this?
So, the whole thing about SDGs, like I said earlier, is about trying to get somewhere. And once you figure out what that norm is, where you want to get to, zero poverty, zero hunger, for example, then you have to work back from the time that you want to get there to where you are at the current point in time. So it means two things. You have a norm which has been set, or you have to interpret it locally, and there is where you currently are. And then, of course, year on year, you have to track how well you're doing. Are you doing better than the trajectory that will get you from here to there? Are you doing worse? And if you're doing worse, what can you do to improve things? So that's why this monitoring and evaluation process is quite important. There's monitoring and evaluation systems that are in place all the way up from the local level to the global. So this is what national statistical offices do. The challenge for us is that many cities don't actually have these systems in place because they never had to measure them. Cities historically have not thought about climate change till quite quickly, but now that they are really working very hard to try and understand what's happening. So when you have to look at what you're dealing with in terms of mitigation, you have to have some sense of your carbon inventory. How much of carbon dioxide, for example, are you putting out? How much of that is coming from buildings? How much of that is coming from your transportation systems? And if you change your transportation systems from, let's say, IC engine-driven vehicles into electric cars, how could that change? Or even better, if you move it to walking, cycling, and public transport, how much could you actually make a change? So These are very specific questions, but you have to monitor and track them, because remember, these are systemic challenges. So in systemic challenges, you have to really get a whole sense of what's happening and the interaction between the processes that make a difference. Spatial structure and what kind of transportation system you have, the incomes people have, and whether you need to be able to try and provide support for people who are, let's say, don't have adequate incomes to be able to access the public transportation system. Do you have things that actually connect between a trunk, mass transit system and connectivity at, in the last mile? Those are the kind of things that you have to track and understand. And these monitoring systems at the local level may actually look at things that are very different from what you may have at national level and what we may be using at global level to try and pull things together. But there's no doubt about the fact that you need to monitor, because if you don't monitor and you evaluate how you're doing, you can never improve. And this is all about rapid, systematic, and systemic change. So they're important, and I think the quicker most of us get into actually building and using these things, the better it will be for us to try and achieve what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Aro. Ami asks, in Module 5, we talked of the importance of education and how we need to impart creativity and social awareness to our children. As you know from the recent Pratham's SER report, that our children do not have even the basic learning skills. How can we make education inclusive? If this is the situation in India, I wonder what is the situation like in African countries? Based on your vast experience, can you suggest what should be done?
Well, actually, that's a huge assumption. A lot of African countries have much better education systems than India. So, this is a question of context in some senses. So, I guess 2 or 3 responses. The first thing is that, in a rapidly changing world, it's really, we're being very instrumental if you only look at learning outcomes. This is a particular discourse which, I'm not necessarily very comfortable with, because it comes from a neoliberal understanding in which some people will go to higher education and other people will actually go to skill training and vocationalization, and hence, this sort of breakdown of skills and learning outcomes are critical. So I'm not debating the fact that, that in places in some parts of the world, including India, especially in certain kinds of schools, basic things of how to read and write, etc., are much, much slower than they should be. So how does one address those questions, especially in an urban context? Now, cities give you the advantage of actually aggregating large numbers of people, which basically means that you can provide access to a school much easier, and you can actually improve the quality of education much faster than you would be if you were in villages which have very low densities where people have to travel very far. Right? That's that's the first advantage you have in, let's say, in education in urban areas or in towns. What that means is that if you plan and organize yourself adequately, you can provide universal access to high quality services and processes. The challenge, of course, is most of our education systems are focused on a few things which are important but not critical. They're focused on buildings, they're focused on infrastructure, and while that's really important. If you don't have adequate toilets in your school, you don't have adequate water, it becomes very difficult for children to come there. Eventually, it's not a very attractive environment. The real challenge for us, at least in my experience, is to deal with the question of the teaching learning environment. And the most important set of people in the teaching learning environment are teachers. So we have, for very, very long periods of time, in many parts of the world, not focused on actually strengthening our teaching systems, investing in teachers, paying them properly, training them well, and giving them the respect and the place in society that they actually deserve. Because they're doing one of the most difficult things, and that is working with young people and helping them understand and make sense of a very complicated and pretty messy world. Otherwise, in some senses, we wouldn't have had the SDGs. So I think the focus on the teacher is something that we really have to enable. And once you have the focus on the teacher herself is able to then transform the teaching learning environment. Children and young people across the world are just like each other. They're all smart. They want to do new things. They want to use new technology. They want to learn a whole range of things. The barriers often come from poverty or access, etc., which we have to solve, obviously. Or sometimes, young people are forced to work when they're not ready to do so, and the state and other agencies have to make sure that universal access to education. SDGs talk about middle school. I would say even going further into high school should be possible, and those who actually would like to and be able to join higher education should provide that. And we now have the methods and technology, the means to actually pull them together. So I think looking at things in terms of learning outcomes is a narrow way of doing things. We have to look at education as a much more holistic process, as a process of building human capacity, and human capacity is not about the knowledge, not only about the knowledge you have, certainly not about the information. It's about your ability, like we're trying to do in this course, of looking at things holistically, trying to answer a whole range of questions, and being able to apply the knowledge that you have, the knowledge that others have, to solve practical problems on the ground. So the quicker we do that, and we've got many examples, of course from India and many other parts of the world, of this being done effectively. And I think I've seen some really remarkable experiments in education going to scale in parts of Africa. So I would say there's a lot to be done from Africa. It's not only Asia or Europe or, let's say, the Americas that are ahead of the world in this space. There's a question about, I'm just looking at this up on our screen. There's a question about job profiles to be evolved for policymaking and execution on the ground. So I think the first thing about employment and jobs is we have to look at the stage in which the country actually is situated. So, I mean, historically, many countries in the world have gone from agriculture to manufacturing and to services. Now, the particular challenge of countries in South Asia, and India included, similar to Pakistan, Bangladesh, maybe even Sri Lanka, is that these are service sector-led economies. So when we're not talking about the job profiles, we have to match where we think the jobs are going to be created, both in terms of sectors, is it going to be in healthcare or tourism or government or education or whatever it is, or in information technology, services sector, and the places in which they take place. Will the job growth, or should the job growth be taking place in smaller towns, or should they be taking place in larger metropolitan cities? These are questions of fact and also a projection, because if you can't answer those questions over the next decade or so, you'll be in some trouble. Because if you want to provide, let's say, whatever, 10, 15 million new jobs, like in the case of India, each year, you better figure out where you want to create them and in which places. These are very concrete, tangible questions. Will they be coming in the north of the country, or the west, or the east, and in what sectors? And what you need to create those jobs? You need the investment, you need the infrastructure, linkages, you need the financial systems. All of them are part of the whole, that whole deal. And every town and city that's going to actually pick them up and run with them have to have all of those factors to be in place. If they don't, then whether you're a small enterprise or a large transnational corporation, it will be obviously very difficult for you to come there. You may not even want to come there. And of course, you may not be able to create the kind of employment opportunities that you may seek to. So I think you need to be very pragmatic about that kind of question. There are some questions about micro-scale solutions to solve macro problems. There's a question from Anubhuti. Of course, the thing is this: macro solutions boil up from a whole range of micro and measurable processes. The challenge we often have is that we try and aggregate. I mean, typically, this is the whole thing that happens in many places in the world. NGOs find, or communities find, local solutions. They work very well in a particular locality. When you move it to another locality in the same city, it may not work. When you move it to another city in another context, you move from a coastal city to one that's in the hills or in the mountains, it doesn't work at all, because the context is different, cultural, economic, environmental, etc. So I would say one of the interesting challenges we have in terms of sustainable urbanization is to get the middle level correct, which is that you work at the city level, and from the city level you actually understand context and work from the city level to the micro level downwards. Of course, it's back and forth between what happens at the household level, at the enterprise level, and at the city. And you move through a territorial frame from the city to the region to the country. So in a sense, if you start from the middle and move, upwards and downwards, I think as far as the SDGs are concerned, you may have a much greater chance of success, because at the city level, you can integrate all of these processes, the economic, social, and ecological processes that are necessary. And when a whole range of cities are able to do this in a territorial manner, this will add up to make a change at the macro level. And I think this is a new form of imagination, which is not that easy to happen, because that's not how governments and very often firms are organized. But I think if we have to, in a sense, break the mold and look at these transformative changes, that would be one direction I would really suggest people start looking at. There's a question of the hypothesis of limiting the growth of large cities and moving to a national urban armature composed of several millions. So this is, of course, very contextual. But if you look at the global context, much of the growth and a lot of the new employment, whether it's in Asia or Africa or historically even in Latin America, comes from mid-sized cities. So I think getting things right in secondary or mid-sized cities is very critical for the world and for many countries. And it's interesting because mid-sized cities have the opportunity of connecting with areas around them, which means the job creation potential in terms of agricultural incomes, of connecting with a whole range of other services, become very real and much more complex. Larger metropolitan cities are typically bringing in resources from across the world. They import their oil from the Middle East, they import their food from Australia, whatever it is, they import all kind of luxury goods because they come in by like flowers, for example, from the Netherlands, because they're flying on aircraft, because people there are rich enough to make them happen. But in most places where we really have to go through this grind of trying to enable sustainability, it is the medium-sized cities where the battle, in some senses, will be fought and won. And because it's easier in terms of scale and size to influence and make those changes, I would say you have a much better chance of actually achieving something in a 100,000 city or town in some places than in a 10 million city in some senses. But things are different in different contexts. Some places are extremely vibrant and very active, even at a mega city size, and they have the advantage of history because they've been at it for 100, 150 years. So it's different from a place that's just starting just now to move things forward. There's a question about CSR activity not being mandatory. Now, well, I mean, CSR is corporate social responsibility. For those of you who may not be familiar in all parts of the world. Now, of course, the thing is this: that corporations are important. In fact, many large corporations are bigger than many countries in terms of economic activity. And I'm glad that in many parts of the world, there is at least this growing recognition that corporate organizations that are very often focused on profit and quarter by quarter returns have something to do with the societies in which they function, and of course to deal with the environmental challenges that they may be able to deal with very well, or in some cases create large-scale economic activity, especially by large corporations, because they tend to externalize all the costs and appropriate much of the profits is a matter of considerable concern. So it's a good thing to have corporate citizens. Of course, as we know across the world, the bulk of the enterprises of the world are actually small and medium enterprises. It's not the large corporations. The large corporations may actually grab a considerable amount of the value added. But if you look at the employment, the engagement, and the opportunity to build out on the sustainability front, the real challenges of reaching out and engaging with small and medium enterprises, whether it's United States or it's Bangladesh or whatever, or it's Nigeria, those things are, I think, relatively similar in common. So the question, of course, is CSR works very often driven by market regulation, where it says, the world is becoming highly unequal. In fact, there are a whole range of people who've cornered, a few hundred people who've cornered large amounts of the world's wealth. So they should be giving back. Some of them are doing it voluntarily, and others are, in a sense, are being forced to do that in very, very, very limited ways by things like CSR, either in or taxation in some senses. So CSR, I think, is an interesting new thing to try and deal with innovation, but I would think I would be very skeptical about even a mid-sized city actually making sure it delivers public services through CSR. That will actually happen through significant public engagement, public finances, and of course community-based processes. It's a mix of both of those things. And individual households and people, communities working together, and of course public processes. So there is no getting away from the fact that this is important. You cannot run urban areas and communities without that engagement. Corporations can have to supply some of those services. They can be service providers. They can even provide a bit of money to have things going. But if you don't have taxation and accountability and other processes, at least much of the history of the urban world is it doesn't work. There's a question about dealing with people with disabilities. That's a very important question, and this is something that I think we struggle with pretty much, whether you're a rich city or you're a poor city. Of course, if you're in an environment which is less well endowed, it becomes more complicated, because first of all, there are a fairly large proportion of people in the world who suffer from or are differently able to various degrees and extents. And whether it's questions of visual acuity or hearing or just physical mobility, not every country in the world actually has legislation that enables this as a right. So the UN of course has a framework in this place, but whether it translates out into the national framework in terms of rights of people with different abilities, and then of course it's nice to have a right, but if you don't have the framework to try and operationalize that in very simple things. You have ramps to exit and enter buildings. Do you have adequate toilets as far as that's concerned? Do people with visual impairment, are they able to traverse environments adequately? Are they able to access teaching learning environments in colleges and schools? Is it possible for mixed environments where people with different abilities are actually in the same learning environment? And it's expensive sometimes. It requires technology. It certainly requires training and sensitization. So I think this is an area where obviously barrier-free design is important, but this is something which requires both consciousness, mobilization, and support from the household all the way up into public spaces. We can't externalize all of this on individuals or particular sets of systems to support that, but our public spaces, our public transportation systems, are spaces where people will look for entertainment and engaging with each other. They need to be accessible. Otherwise, in a sense, you're committing a serious offense against the right of every citizen to be able to participate fully in the life of the city. So I think we need to do more in many places. There are more institutions that are starting to do with this, but I think there are a few places. I mean, I'll give you an example. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was in Perth, and it was interesting because I had to catch a plane in the evening, and we got out from the hotel I was staying early in the morning, and I was dragging my bag all over town. I'm literally all over town. I literally travel all over town with public transport because I was with one of the world's leading accessibility public transportation person, and he said, let's do this all by public transport. So I must have probably walked about 7 or 8 kilometers that day, but with a bag. And it was very interesting because in actual fact, unlike many other cities, including some of the most well-endowed cities in the world, the big mega cities, whether it's London or New York or Chicago, things like that, I never really had a problem dragging that bag behind. 10 wheels, of course. But the barrier-free access that you could see from the public transport, whether it was a tram or a train, or it was walking across the city, across pavements and crossing things, was actually remarkably good. I had to be a little cautious about some things and maybe take a slightly longer route because obviously going down a set of steps is faster than going down a path. But at the end of the day, it was not an exhausting experience. So it was an interesting reflection. You can actually do this. Of course, Perth is a city that is from a country which has got more resources than many others. But it's a question of looking at adequate design in this particular case, having your regulations in place and making sure that this can actually happen. It can be done. It can be done, I think, at relatively low cost. But we have to innovate a lot to figure out how to do this. There's a question about infrastructure-led urbanization, such as smart cities. Now, I'm not sure that smart cities are actually infrastructure-led urbanization. I mean, smartness is an idea that works in some contexts. It's been both abused and misused in many environments. I mean, like we've tried to deal with over these many weeks, it's not only one thing that makes a place a great place to live, or to work in, or to be educated. You can't say that I put all the infrastructure inside and have a place which actually is desperately unsafe for women and for children. It doesn't work. So you have to keep the balance between social processes and in some senses, creating of employment and livelihoods is not only just an economic activity. It's a question of the social networks at work. And for example, if women are not able to participate actively in economic activity in the city, how far is that city or that country going to go? Because there's serious questions of public safety, lighting is inadequate. There's no childcare. Their partners don't necessarily help support childcare in some senses, and there's limited mobility. Let's say after dark, you have to change these things. And infrastructure itself is not the thing that makes it happen. It's a question of the culture and the services, and actually making sure the services actually work. You can have a very rich city which has neighborhoods which are completely run down and very dangerous to go to. You can see that pretty much across the world. Or you can have places that are apparently very poor, where the community engagement is so good that at any point of time people don't leave their houses shut. In fact, in some ways, I would say how safe a child in the city is really an important way of trying to see how smart and how sensitive it is. So you can have an awful amount of IT, you can have a whole range of other things, but if the people themselves are not secure, if their lives are not fulfilled, you have an innate environment. It doesn't work in some sense. It's all about people and the way that they actually function. So yeah, such is important. That's not
Thanks.
Sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks, Aro. The next question is from Shaheen.
Yeah.
Chat. She wants to know if the transport investment in Bangalore city is still largely in the automobile-based paradigm. Currently, the government is pushing for the elevated corridor system. Do you think this solution is further good for the mobility in the city?
Interesting question. I mean, this is a little bit of a biased question because I partially answered this in a conversation we had yesterday with some of the most senior bureaucrats in the city. So the thing is, like many other mega cities of the world, Bangalore is a city in southern India which has a strong, has had strong growth because it has a lot of innovation, a lot of IT and textiles and a whole range of things. City. Now, the interesting thing that people don't know is, many people don't know, is that a large proportion of the city actually walks to work if they're poor, if they're working, textile worker working in many textile factories, or if they're domestic workers, they actually walk to work, or they use public transport. So the city actually has a fairly high proportion of public transport, and unlike many other cities in South Asia, it's been able to maintain that because the bus systems are better than most. I mean, people who travel in the buses are not necessarily completely happy with them, but it's better than other places. But because incomes have risen very quickly in the city, and the city structure has been allowed to grow remarkably, it's grown, it's one of the more rapidly growing mega cities in part of the world. Distances have become very strong, and because the urban, fabric has been segregated by the process of planning, where where you live and where you work is quite far from each other. You might be traveling an hour, sometimes an hour and a half to get from one place. So, what is the solution that people have taken in the absence of a rapid, metro transit system, which is now slowly coming into place? They buy, motorbikes and scooters, and if they have more money or they have more aspirations to buy a car. In fact, this city, I think now for a population of maybe 12 million or so, has 8 million vehicles. It's kind of insane. And unfortunately, for a city that was considered to be quite green and had an environment where people would want to come and live here, obviously this would, if you have so many vehicles and you actually use them, your air pollution levels are going to go up tremendously. Of course, India's got a very bad record in this case. millions of young people, older people, and citizens are seriously affected with the weather. So this is part of a framework which many of us have contested for a while, and saying that the car has been seen, or the IC engine vehicle has been seen as a form of independence and freedom. In the short run, it may seem so, but in the long run, it's something that is tapering off in many parts of the world. Motorization is actually decreasing, even in the high countries, and it's a very bad idea to move towards private transport if you're looking at the sustainability and the livability and the walkability of urban areas in the south. So, but it means that you have to change your planning paradigm. It basically means that you have to disincentivize a whole range of things that make a lot of noise and put out a lot of pollution and do stuff. But you can't do that immediately because people need to move, they need to work. So obviously it's public transportation systems that are critical as far as it's concerned, things that are accessible, safe, and affordable, and making the city much more walkable, and that means changing how the urban fabric and densities actually work to get its way out. So I think, and I hope that Bangalore starts moving in that direction because, I guess from those of us who have experience in transportation systems, the more elevated expressways you cause, the more traffic jams you can see. And the classic example of this, starting from let's say, I've seen it myself from the 80s onwards to the 2000s, was Bangkok, where you were not only doing one level of elevated road, you were doing another level on top of that. So you have the super expressway that runs over the expressway, and that doesn't help. I mean, I've personally been in traffic jams in Bangkok that last 5 hours long, which is, completely insane. Why should you do that? You might as well, move and set up a caravan and live on the road. So this is because of misguided ideas of urban structure and inadequate planning. I think from the context of climate, equity, jobs, pretty much everything. This is a bad way to go, and it's changing, but it better change very fast. Otherwise, it's going to be miserable for lots of people, and people are dying because of this. I think very, very, it's very inappropriate and unethical.
We have less than 10 minutes left on this webinar, Aro, so we will be taking a last few questions. Anubhuti from the live chat wants to know, don't you think we should also be teaching rural planning, since 60% of our country lies in the area and a much critical concern, saving them from urbanization, migration, and transit development?
Well, of course. It's, in some senses, when we're talking about sustainable urbanization, it's not only talking about metropolitan areas. It's the entire continuum of the settlement structure. So, many parts of the world, in fact, some of the most livable parts of the world, let's say in parts of Europe, people go to Europe, they have a very large number of people coming as tourists to travel to small towns and villages. Why is that? Because there's actually a fabric there which enables people to feel at home, to connect with nature, live a fulfilled life, etc., irrespective of the size of the place that they live in. So, of course, the relationship between nature, the countryside, agricultural areas, smaller and larger settlements is something that we have to understand and deal with. This is very important. Of course, it's challenging for a country like India, which has 640,000 such villages. But inevitably, that's a question that we have to engage with. The unfortunate thing, as far as that's concerned, is that most of the talent that goes into dealing with these questions goes into large metropolitan areas because people get more money for the jobs that they get in those places. But if you don't actually have what in the old days, slightly, I would say, a little jaded paradigm of town and country planning, let's say, you won't get very far. You can't keep the balance without that. So if you're looking at ecological services, and cities can't survive without a symbiotic relationship with these services, you have to inevitably look at dealing with the question of so-called rural areas. But these boundaries and these binaries are getting blurred, and I think we have to look at each of the systems that we showed you in the course and try and see how they can be addressed in a hierarchy of places.
Thanks, Aro. This is the last question for today's webinar, and this question is from Bangalore. The city is currently trying to procure electric buses, which although in principle sounds good, with only 6,000 buses and 1.5 lakh private vehicles on road, the shift is hardly useful to reduce emissions or pollution. The city lacks a similar policy in private vehicles. Besides, electricity is still primarily coal-based. So these are also issues that need more nuanced and holistic responses instead of formulaic buying of electric buses. What is the best course of action? The what's the best course of action for the government regarding this? How can individuals and civil society help?
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions from Bangalore. But basically, I mean, if you read the piece of work that we brought out last year from the IPCC, the 1.5 report, or specifically the summary for urban policymakers, which I had to write, came out for COP24 last year, the strategic issue here is, if you have to deal with climate question, and this is, I guess, a climate-related question, is you have to electrify. There's no question about the fact that electric mobility and electrification of processes is a much more efficient way to actually deliver energy to enable end use services. So electrification is the way to go. And if you go to, let's say, Shenzhen, for example, or many Chinese cities, there's been a remarkable shift that's taken place literally over the last 3 to 5 years in terms of electrification. So you're getting saturation in some sense in some cities, not only of private vehicles, which is also important, but also public transportation, where 6,000 buses is a small number. Actually, the bulk of the electric vehicles, public vehicles in many Chinese cities have now moved to electric vehicles. So the point that you're making is absolutely correct. That if you have a dirty grid, which is coal-based power and supplying to electric vehicles, in terms of gross emissions, there may not be much difference. However, electric vehicles themselves have many benefits. They obviously pollute less. That's pretty obvious. And citizens actually like that. It improves their health. And that, in a sense, in many places, actually helps a positive spiral where people want to move to cleaner and cleaner ways. That's sort of one part of it. The second thing, of course, is that once you have an electric grid in place, you can actually incentivize the shift to renewable power. So in the state that you're talking about, let's say in the state in which Bangalore sits, in Karnataka, they are some of the largest solar power installations in the world. They are one, they have 1 gigawatt single, let's say, square kilometer scale units that located in the state. So, though it's not the best way forward in terms of renewable energy, but you can then start substituting those solar power plants with, the coal-fired power plants with these solar units because they're cheaper and they can just plug into the same grid. Of course, the more interesting thing is when you have rooftop units in the city, A, B, you have electric vehicles in the city. So the rooftop solar units then can connect with vehicles and you can start charging them during the day. So you actually have a distributed system of energy production and generation in the city, which is very dynamic and demand-based. So you can actually reduce the overall costs of consumption and storage, and you can get away with one of the most significant challenges we have with many renewable energy sources like photovoltaics, and that is they only work for 6 or 8 hours in a day. Because if you have the cars that are electric, you can then store the energy in the cars, and they can give back the energy into the grid system during the night when they're also not being used. So there are considerable advantages of using electric vehicles. I'm not saying that they're the most benign things in the world, both in the production and their use. They take energy, they take resources, and we can improve resource efficiency. We can actually move in that direction. But given the horrible challenges that we have of air pollution, of accessibility, the shift to electric vehicles is going to be an important step forward. Eventually, of course, the answer is not moving people around significantly if they can walk. And in a city like Bangalore, where the weather is quite good for 10 months in the year, people can walk or bicycle safely, and they have places where they're working with which are close to their homes. Then and of course, access to the internet and all kinds of other interesting things. So new forms of work emerge. You don't really have to run around and travel just to stay alive. If you want to do that for fun, it's a different thing. You don't have to do that to stay alive. But electric vehicles are an important step in the direction to deal with motorization and change the structure and, of course, reduce the risks and improve the resilience of urban systems.
With this, we'll wrap up this webinar. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time during the course of this MOOC. It has been a rich learning experience for our viewers. Any closing comments from you?
No, I think it's been great fun. I mean, what I can tell you is, those of you who lasted till the end, that at the end of this thing, we've done this. This is the 4th cycle we're running of this course. There are almost 20,000 people who registered for the course. Of course, not every one of them really completed it because people have lots of other competing kind of challenges. But we now have people who've actually been on this course from 150 countries. That's a big number, and we're hoping that you will stay in touch with us. We're hoping most, of course, that you will actually start doing something about the stuff that we're talking about in your own context, in other locations. Some of you may actually find the opportunity of new kinds of jobs. Some of you may be inspired to do new kinds of to address new kinds of questions in your research, and hopefully, sort of giving you a perspective of how the world can be a different place, and it's actually happening in real time. Maybe not as quickly as we would like it to be, but it's certainly happening. And this aspiration that I think many of us share of trying to, in a very concrete way, build a better, more equitable, much more environmentally sustainable world. In spite of all the difficult challenges and the horrible things that we see in the media, is starting to happen brick by brick, and that's the only way we can make it happen. But we have to make it happen a little bit faster than it would happen on its own. So I think each one of you is going to be important in making this a reality, and we're very glad to have had the opportunity of interacting and stay in touch. Tell people about what we're doing, and get other people come to this course once we rerun the next version later in the year. The more people who do this and who practice it, the quicker the world will change. So thank you so much. It's been a wonderful opportunity from many of us on this end, colleagues from across the world, from IHS and the SG Academy and edX. Thank you for your time, for your commitment, and all the best.
Thank you again for your active participation. We apologize if you weren't able to go through all your questions. You can write to us at cities@sdgacademy.org. We wish you good luck with completing the course. You can find a recording of this webinar under the weekly webinar tab on your course page in a few days. Thank you for your active participation. Have a good evening.